The forge burned hotter than it had in months, casting dancing shadows across the dirt floor of the blacksmith shop. Abel Jackson's hands moved with practiced precision as he shaped the final tumbler for the master key, the one that would open every door on the Witfield plantation. Tomorrow morning, Master Witfield would take possession of this key, the symbol of his absolute control over everything and everyone on his land. But Abel had other plans. The key glowed red-hot in the darkness, and Abel knew that by sunrise, he would be gone. What Master Witfield didn't know, what nobody could have predicted, was that every single lock on the plantation would stand wide open by dawn, and the man who forged them would have vanished into the Georgia night like smoke from his own forge. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The summer of 1839 had been merciless in its heat, the kind of oppressive Georgia summer that made breathing feel like swallowing hot soup. Abel had been working the forge since before sunrise, just as he had every day for the past 12 years, since Master Witfield purchased him at auction in Savannah. He was 28 years old now, though the lines around his eyes and the calluses on his hands made him look older. The forge had been both his prison and his education, the place where he learned to bend iron to his will, to understand the secret language of metal and fire. Master Richard Witfield owned one of the largest cotton plantations in Hancock County, spanning nearly 2,000 acres of red Georgia clay. The main house stood 3 stories tall, painted white with columns that reached toward the sky like the fingers of a dead man grasping at heaven. Around it clustered the various outbuildings, the slave quarters, the cotton gin, the stables, and Abel's forge, positioned far enough from the main house that the constant ringing of hammer on anvil wouldn't disturb the master's peace, but close enough that Whitfield could check on his valuable blacksmith whenever suspicion struck him. Abel had forged every lock on the plantation over the years. He'd made the chains that bound his own people, the shackles that bit into their ankles, the bars that turned windows into cages. Each piece of metalwork was a small damnation of his soul, but also a lesson in the mechanics of captivity. He understood intimately how locks worked, how tumblers aligned, how springs compressed, how the right combination of pressure and position could make any barrier swing open. This knowledge had been growing inside him like a seed in dark soil, waiting for the right moment to break through into light. The commission for the master key had come 3 weeks earlier. Master Witfield had called Abel up to the main house, a rare summons that made Abel's heart pound with the particular fear that came from being noticed. The master sat in his study, surrounded by ledgers that tracked every bale of cotton, every bushel of corn, every human life he claimed as property. He was a tall man with graying hair and eyes the color of a winter sky, cold and distant. He dressed impeccably even in the Georgia heat, his waistcoat buttoned tight, his cravat perfectly knotted. Richard Witfield was a third-generation plantation owner, a man who had inherited not just land and wealth, but an entire worldview that placed him at the apex of a natural hierarchy. His grandfather had established the plantation in the late 1700s, clearing the red Georgia clay and building the foundations of what would become a substantial fortune. His father had expanded the operation, adding more acreage, more enslaved workers, more cotton gins and processing facilities. Richard had taken over 15 years earlier and had proven himself a shrewd businessman, maximizing profits while maintaining the veneer of gentility that marked the Southern planter class. He considered himself a benevolent master, better than many of his neighbors, who were known for particular cruelty. He provided adequate food and clothing, allowed religious services on Sundays, and rarely used the whip himself, preferring to delegate such unpleasantness to his overseers. He took pride in the productivity of his plantation, in the quality of his cotton, in the efficiency of his operations. That this efficiency was built on the forced labor of human beings he classified as property was, to him, simply the natural order of things, the way the world had always been and always would be. Abel had observed Whitfield carefully over the years, had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the master's moods and intentions. He knew that Whitfield was under financial pressure, that the previous year's cotton crop had been damaged by an early frost, that debts were accumulating. He knew that Whitfield's eldest son had gambling problems and that substantial sums had been sent north to cover losses. He knew that Whitfield's wife was ill, confined to her rooms on the second floor, and that the master's temper had grown shorter as her condition worsened. All of this information Abel had gathered from Sarah, who heard things in the main house, and from his own observations during his occasional visits to perform repairs. Knowledge was power. His father had taught him, and Abel had become an avid collector of knowledge about Master Whitfield, about the plantation's finances, about the weaknesses in the system that bound them all. Abel, he had said, not looking up from his papers, I require a master key, one that will open every lock on this plantation. The individual keys have become burdensome. I want one key that grants me access to everything. You understand? Abel had understood perfectly. Whitfield was consolidating control, reducing complexity, creating a single point of access that would allow him to move quickly through his domain without the inconvenience of managing dozens of separate keys. It was the kind of efficiency that appealed to Whitfield's orderly mind, the kind of streamlining that he applied to every aspect of plantation management. Yes, Master Whitfield, Abel had replied, keeping his eyes down, his voice neutral. Inside, his mind had already begun racing through possibilities. A master key meant understanding the entire lock system of the plantation, meant creating something that could interface with every mechanism Abel had installed over the years. It meant total access, complete control, the ability to open any door, any gate, any barrier. And if Whitfield could have such a key, then so could Abel. I want it to be exceptional work, your finest craftsmanship. I've been invited to the governor's mansion next month, and I intend to bring it as a gift after I've had copies made. Let it be a demonstration of the quality of work produced on Whitfield land. The master's pride was evident in his voice, as if Abel's skill was his own achievement, as if the years of practice and study were somehow Whitfield's to claim credit for. The irony was not lost on Abel. Whitfield wanted to present the key as evidence of his own superiority, his ability to command excellence from his property. He wanted to impress the governor, to secure political favors, to strengthen his position in Georgia society. The key would be a symbol of his power, his wealth, his status. He had no idea that it would become something else entirely, a symbol of his failure to truly control those he claimed to own. I'll need access to all the locks, Abel had said carefully, to measure them, to ensure the key works properly with each one. It will take time, Whitfield had waved his hand dismissively. Of course, of course. Take whatever time you need. I want it perfect. I'll inform the overseers that you have my permission to move freely about the plantation for this project. Test each lock as thoroughly as necessary. Permission to move freely. Access to every lock. Time to study and measure and understand the complete system. Whitfield was handing Abel the tools of his own undoing. Gift wrapped in the language of master and slave, never imagining that the enslaved man before him was capable of seeing beyond the immediate task to the larger possibilities. Abel, he had said, not looking up from his papers, I require a master key, one that will open every lock on this plantation. The individual keys have become burdensome. I want one key that grants me access to everything. You understand? Yes, Master Whitfield. Abel had replied, keeping his eyes down. His voice, neutral. Inside, his mind had already begun racing through possibilities. I want it to be exceptional work. Your finest craftsmanship. I've been invited to the governor's mansion next month, and I intend to bring it as a gift after I've had copies made. Let it be a demonstration of the quality of work produced on Witfield land. The master's pride was evident in his voice, as if Abel's skill was his own achievement. Abel had nodded, accepted the commission, and returned to his forge with his heart hammering in his chest. A master key, access to everything. The irony was so sharp it could cut. Master Whitfield wanted Abel to forge the ultimate symbol of his power, never imagining that the very act of creation would be the key's undoing. Over the following weeks, Abel had worked on the key with meticulous care. During the day, he performed his regular duties, repairing farm equipment, shoeing horses, creating nails and hinges, and whatever else the plantation required. But at night, after the other enslaved people had returned to their quarters, and the overseers had retreated to their own homes, Abel remained in the forge, working by lamplight on the master key. He told the overseers he was perfecting the design, that such an important commission required extra hours. They believed him because it never occurred to them that Abel might have his own agenda. The process of creating the master key was complex and required absolute precision. Abel began by visiting every lock on the plantation, examining each one, taking careful measurements with tools he'd crafted himself. He studied the pin configurations, the spring tensions, the tolerances of each lock mechanism. Some of the locks were simple affairs, easy to open with basic picks. Others were more sophisticated, imported from England or manufactured in the north, with multiple pins and security features designed to resist tampering. Abel created detailed drawings of each lock, sketches that showed the internal mechanisms, the way the pins aligned, the path the key would need to take. These drawings he hid carefully, rolled up and secreted in a hollow space he'd created in the forge's brick wall. He worked methodically, lock by lock, building a comprehensive map of the plantation's security system in his mind and on paper. The actual forging of the keys required the finest steel Abel could obtain. He'd saved scraps from various projects, pieces of high-quality metal that he'd set aside over months. For the master's key, he used new steel that Whitfield had purchased specifically for the project, the best available, properly tempered and without flaws. For his own duplicate key, Abel used his hoarded scraps, carefully welding them together, heating and hammering until the disparate pieces became a single whole. Each key required multiple forgings. Abel would heat the steel until it glowed orange-red, then hammer it on the anvil, shaping the blank that would become the key's shaft. The work required precise control. Each hammer blow calculated to move the metal exactly where it needed to go. Too much force and the steel would thin unevenly. Too little, and it wouldn't take the proper shape. Abel had been doing this work for 12 years, and his hands knew the rhythm, knew the feel of steel at the right temperature, knew when to quench and when to continue working. The key's teeth were the most critical element. These had to be cut with absolute precision, each one positioned and sized to lift the pins in every lock on the plantation to exactly the right height. Abel used files of varying coarseness, working slowly and carefully, checking his progress against the measurements he'd taken. A single error, a tooth cut too deep or too shallow, and the key wouldn't work. He tested each key repeatedly, first on practice locks he'd set up in the forge, then on the actual plantation locks during his nighttime rounds. Young Isaiah often appeared at the forge during these late-night sessions, unable to sleep, drawn by curiosity and the light from the forge fire. He was 14 years old, assigned to work in the fields, but possessed of a quick mind and an insatiable hunger for knowledge. Abel had been teaching him basic metalworking when time allowed, showing him how to repair simple tools, how to sharpen plow blades, how to understand the properties of different metals. What makes that key so special? Isaiah had asked one night, watching Abel file away at the key's teeth with minute precision. It looks like any other key to me. Abel had paused in his work, considering how much to tell the boy. Isaiah was trustworthy, had already proven his discretion in other matters, but the fewer people who knew the full extent of Abel's plans, the safer everyone would be. Still, the boy deserved some truth, deserved to understand that resistance was possible. This key will open every lock on the plantation, Abel had explained. Every door, every gate, every barrier. Master Witfield thinks it's a symbol of his power, his control over everything here. But really, it's a demonstration that all those locks, all those barriers, they're just mechanisms. They can be understood. And if they can be understood, they can be defeated. Isaiah's eyes had widened with understanding. You're going to use it to escape. I'm going to use it to show everyone that escape is possible. Abel had corrected. That the walls around us aren't as solid as they seem. That we're not as powerless as they want us to believe. The boy had been quiet for a long moment, watching the forge fire dance and shift. My mother was sold south 3 years ago, he finally said. Just sold her away when Master Witfield needed cash. Never even got to say goodbye. I don't even know if she's still alive. Abel had felt the familiar anger rising in his chest, the rage at the casual cruelty of a system that separated families as easily as one might separate coins into piles. I know, Isaiah, that's why this matters. That's why someone has to demonstrate that we're not just property to be bought and sold, that we're human beings who can think and plan and act. When you go, Isaiah had said. Abel had wanted to say yes, wanted to take this bright young man away from the plantation, give him a chance at the life he deserved. But he knew the dangers, knew that a 14-year-old boy would slow him down, would make them both more visible, would reduce the chances of success. Not this time, he'd said gently, but I'll leave something behind for you. Knowledge, understanding, the tools to forge your own freedom when the time comes. The nights continued, the keys taking shape under Abel's skilled hands. He worked with a focus that bordered on meditation, each file stroke deliberate, each test of the mechanism careful and thorough. The master's key was becoming a work of art. The scroll work on its handle, intricate and beautiful, a demonstration of Abel's mastery of his craft. His own duplicate key was simpler, lacking the decorative elements, but functionally identical. Old Marcus visited the forge several times during this period, bringing food, offering quiet support, sometimes just sitting in the corner and watching Abel work. Marcus had been on the plantation longer than anyone else, had seen masters come and go, had witnessed generations of enslaved people born and die within the boundaries of Witfield land. He carried with him the accumulated wisdom of decades, the lessons learned from countless attempts at resistance, both successful and failed. You remind me of a man I knew long time ago, Marcus had said one night, his voice rough with age and old sorrows. Man named Daniel. He was a carpenter, could build anything. Whitfield's daddy, the old master, he had Daniel build this big fancy coach, something to impress the other plantation owners. Daniel spent months on it, made it beautiful, every joint perfect, every piece of wood chosen and shaped just right. Abel had continued filing, listening but focused on his work. Marcus's stories always had a point, even if it took time to arrive. Day that coach was finished, Marcus continued. Daniel loaded his tools into it, hitched up the horses, and drove it right off the plantation, made it almost to the Tennessee line before they caught him, brought him back, whipped him near to death, sold him away to a plantation down in Alabama, never saw him again. Abel had stopped filing, looking up at the old man. You're warning me. I'm telling you stories, Marcus had replied. Whether you hear them as warnings or inspiration, that's up to you. But I will say this. Daniel failed because he acted alone, because nobody knew what he was planning, because when he was gone, there was nobody left to carry on what he'd started. You're doing something different. You're not just running, you're teaching, you're showing. That might make all the difference. What they didn't see was that Abel was forging two keys. The master key for Witfield was a work of art, its handle decorated with intricate scroll work, its shaft perfectly machined to turn every lock on the plantation. But hidden in the back of Abel's leather apron, wrapped in oiled cloth, was an identical key. This second key had been forged in secret, created from scraps of metal that Abel had carefully collected and hoarded over months, filed down and shaped during stolen moments when no one was watching. Abel had learned metalwork from his father, back before they were separated at auction. His father had been a freeman in Virginia, a skilled blacksmith who owned his own shop, until he made the mistake of defending a woman from an overseer's whip. That act of human decency had cost him everything. He'd been seized, declared a fugitive slave based on forged papers, and sold south along with his son. Abel had been only 16 years old enough to have learned his father's trade, but young enough to still believe that skill and hard work might earn him respect, perhaps even freedom. 12 years had burned that naivety away, like morning fog under the Georgia sun. His father, whose name was Jeremiah, had spent his final years trying to pass on more than just metalworking skills. In the evenings after work, when they had a few precious moments together before exhaustion claimed them, Jeremiah would speak in low tones about freedom, about dignity, about the world as it should be rather than as it was. He spoke about the shop in Virginia, about customers who respected his work, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and useful with his own hands and being paid fairly for it. He spoke about Abel's mother, who had died of fever when Abel was just a baby, and how she had believed that one day slavery would end, that justice would prevail, that their son would live to see a better world. "Remember this, Abel," Jeremiah had said one night, his hands scarred and trembling from years of hard labor. "They can take away your freedom. They can take away your dignity, but they cannot take away what you know. Knowledge lives in here." He tapped his temple, and here he placed his hand over his heart. "Every skill you learn, every secret you discover about how things work, that's yours forever. They can chain your body, but your mind, that stays free if you keep it so." Those words had shaped Abel's approach to his work in the forge. While other enslaved people saw their skills as just another form of exploitation, another way the master profited from their suffering, Abel saw his knowledge as a form of power, a weapon being slowly forged in secret. Every lock he made, he studied. Every chain he forged, he understood intimately. Every shackle and bar and cage became a lesson in the mechanics of captivity. He learned not just how to build these instruments of oppression, but how to defeat them. The forge itself was a substantial structure, built of brick with a high roof to let the heat and smoke escape. It had been constructed 20 years earlier by a previous enslaved blacksmith, a man named Joseph, who had died of lung fever before Abel arrived. The tools were old but well maintained, passed down from one smith to another, like a bitter inheritance. There was a beauty to the space despite its purpose, a kind of terrible poetry in the way firelight played across the brick walls, in the rhythm of hammer on anvil, in the transformation of raw iron into finished objects. Abel had made modifications over the years, small improvements that made the work easier and more efficient. He'd built better racks for the tools, installed a more effective bellows system, created a better drainage system for the quenching trough. Master Witfield had approved these changes because they increased productivity, never realizing that each modification also deepened Abel's understanding of engineering, of mechanics, of how systems could be altered and improved. Every improvement to the forge was also an improvement to Abel's education. His father had died 5 years ago, worked to death in the cotton fields after Master Witfield decided he was too old to be useful at the forge. Abel had inherited his father's tools, his knowledge, and his unspoken dream of freedom. The tools he used every day. The knowledge had been growing, deepening, expanding, and the dream had been crystallizing into a plan. In those 5 years since Jeremiah's death, Abel had changed. The grief had hardened something inside him, transformed sorrow into determination. He'd watched his father's body being carried to the slave cemetery, a small plot behind the quarters where generations of enslaved people had been buried without markers, without names, their existence erased as thoroughly in death as it had been constrained in life. Abel had stood there, dirt falling on his father's plain wooden coffin, and made a silent promise. He would not die here, would not be buried in unmarked earth, would not let his father's sacrifice be meaningless. Sarah had been there that day, had stood beside Abel at the graveside, even though it meant missing her duties at the main house and risking punishment. She was a year younger than Abel, had worked in the Witfield house since she was a child, first as a servant to the master's daughters, then as a cook's assistant, and now as the head housekeeper. She knew the rhythms of the master's life better than anyone, knew when he would be distracted, when he would be vigilant, when opportunities for small rebellions might present themselves. Sarah's grandmother had been brought directly from Africa, had carried with her memories of freedom and stories of a homeland across the sea. These stories had been passed down to Sarah's mother, and then to Sarah herself, keeping alive a connection to a world before slavery, a reminder that their current condition was not natural or inevitable, but imposed by force and maintained by violence. Sarah had taught Abel some of the old songs her grandmother had sung, songs in a language nobody on the plantation understood anymore, but which carried in their melodies a defiance that transcended words. Over the years, Abel and Sarah had developed a careful friendship, one that existed in stolen moments and coded conversations. They could not be open about their connection, could not acknowledge the depth of feeling that had grown between them, because relationships among enslaved people were always vulnerable to the master's whims. Whitfield could sell either of them at any time, could separate them as casually as one might separate animals, and indeed had done so to other couples on the plantation when it suited his financial interests. But in the quiet spaces, in the brief encounters, when Sarah brought Abel his midday meal, or when they crossed paths on a Sunday afternoon, they had built something precious. Sarah understood Abel's hunger for freedom, shared his determination to escape the plantation's boundaries. She had her own plans, her own dreams of the North, of a life lived on her own terms. They had spoken, carefully and quietly, about running together, about making the dangerous journey north as partners rather than alone. It was Sarah who had first brought Abel information about the Underground Railroad, whispered details passed along from a traveling preacher who was secretly a conductor, guiding enslaved people toward freedom. She had learned the names of safe houses, the signals and passwords that would identify Abel as a fugitive seeking help rather than a spy trying to infiltrate the network. She had drawn him maps from memory, sketched out routes that avoided the major roads and towns where slave catchers prowled. "When you go," Sarah had told him one evening, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the forge fire, "you'll need to move fast and stay invisible. The first 3 days are the most dangerous. That's when they'll have the dogs out, when the patrols will be searching every barn and thicket. After that, if you can get far enough, if you can cross into Tennessee, your chances improve." Abel had listened carefully, committing every detail to memory. "Come with me," he'd said, not for the first time. "We can make it together." Sarah had smiled sadly, touching his arm briefly before pulling away, always conscious of who might be watching. "I have my mother to think about, and my sister's children. They depend on me. I can't leave them, Abel. Not yet. But you have to go. You have the skills to make a life up north. You have your father's tools, his knowledge. You can be free, truly free. And that matters. That matters more than you know." "It matters because of people like you," Abel had replied. "Because there are 53 people in these quarters who deserve to be free. who deserve to live as human beings instead of property. If I run, I'm not just running for myself. I'm running to prove it can be done, to show that the barriers aren't as strong as they seem. That conversation had taken place 3 months before the commission for the master key, but it had planted the seed that grew into Abel's plan. He would escape, yes, but he would do it in a way that sent a message, that demonstrated something important to everyone left behind. The unlocking of the doors became the symbol of that message, the physical manifestation of a truth that Abel needed everyone to understand. Freedom was possible. Barriers could be overcome. The architecture of oppression could be dismantled by those who understood how it was built. The key wasn't just about escape. Abel could have run before, slipped away in the night, like dozens of others had tried. Most were caught within days, returned in chains, whipped until their backs looked like plowed fields, sometimes killed as an example to the others. The few who made it to freedom did so through a combination of luck, help from the Underground Railroad, and sheer stubborn will. Abel wanted something more than just his own freedom. He wanted to open every cage. In the quarters, Abel had become someone people came to with their problems. When Sarah's daughter cut her hand on a cotton boll, Abel had heated a knife blade red hot to seal the wound. When old Marcus's back seized up from decades of stooping in the fields, Abel had fashioned a brace from leather and light metal that helped him stand straighter. When young Isaiah asked questions about the world beyond the plantation, Abel shared what he knew, described the free states up north, talked about the abolitionists who fought against slavery, kept hope alive with words when hope was the rarest commodity on Whitfield's land. Abel had been careful never to speak of escape, never to openly advocate resistance. The punishment for such talk was severe, and there were always those who would trade information for favors, desperate enough to betray their own people for an extra ration of food or a day off from the fields. But in private, in whispered conversations after dark, Abel had been making arrangements. He'd been using his position as blacksmith to communicate with people beyond the plantation, with free black tradesmen in town who brought news and messages, with conductors on the Underground Railroad who passed through the county. The plan had come together slowly, piece by piece, like forging a chain link by link. The master key was the final piece, the one that would transform possibility into action. Abel knew every lock on the plantation. He knew which doors led to the food stores, which to the weapons room, which to the master's study, where he kept his papers and his cash box. He knew the lock on the plantation's main gate, the locks on the shackles in the punishment shed, the locks on the storage building where winter clothing was kept. But the plan extended far beyond the plantation boundaries. Abel had been making connections for over a year, carefully and quietly building a network that would support his escape. It had started with Benjamin Hartwell, a free black carpenter who came to the plantation periodically to work on the main house. Hartwell lived in Milledgeville, the state capital, and moved in circles that included both free black tradesmen and white abolitionists. He'd been born free in Maryland, had learned his trade from his father, and had moved south specifically to help enslaved people escape. Their first real conversation had taken place during a repair job on the main house's front porch. Witfield had hired Hartwell to replace rotted floorboards, and Abel had been called up to repair some decorative ironwork on the railing. They'd worked side by side for several hours, and Hartwell had been careful to establish trust before saying anything substantive. "You do fine work," Hartwell had said, examining one of the iron scrolls Abel had just installed. Learned from someone good, I'd wager. My father, Abel had replied. He was a freeman up in Virginia, had his own shop before things changed. Hartwell had nodded slowly, understanding all that Abel hadn't said. I knew a smith in Baltimore. Freeman, did work like yours. Beautiful pieces. He told me once that the best part of being a freeman wasn't the money or the respect. It was knowing that his work belonged to him, that nobody could claim credit for what his hands created. It was a carefully worded statement, one that acknowledged the injustice of Abel's situation without directly advocating anything illegal. Abel had recognized it for what it was, a test, an opening, an invitation to trust. That must be something, Abel had said quietly, to own your own work, to sign your name to it, and have that name mean something. It is something, Hartwell had agreed, and it's something that more people ought to experience. Some people, they find ways to make that happen. Some people head north, find communities that help them establish themselves, help them build lives where their work belongs to them. They'd worked in silence for several minutes after that, but a connection had been established, an understanding reached. Over subsequent visits, Hartwell had shared information more directly. He'd told Abel about the Underground Railroad, about the network of safe houses and sympathetic conductors that stretched from the Deep South all the way to Canada. He'd described routes that were less patrolled, towns where black people could move more freely, signals and passwords that would identify Abel to those who could help him. There's a Quaker family about 40 miles north of here, Hartwell had said during one visit, his voice low. Name of Pemberton. They run a general store, but they also run a station on the railroad. You show up there. You tell them Benjamin sent you. They'll give you food and a place to rest, and they'll pass you on to the next station. From there, it's conductors and safe houses all the way through Tennessee, Kentucky, and into the free states. Abel had memorized every detail, committed names and locations and passwords to memory. He couldn't write any of it down, couldn't risk documentation that might be discovered. Everything had to be carried in his head, along with his knowledge of metalworking, his understanding of locks, his father's teachings, his dreams of freedom. Hartwell had also helped Abel obtain the forged Freedom Papers, documents that identified him as Abel Freeman, a free black blacksmith from Virginia, traveling to Atlanta to seek work. The papers wouldn't hold up to close scrutiny, but they might provide enough cover to get through casual encounters with patrols or curious white people who questioned why a black man was traveling alone. The papers cost me $20, Hartwell had said when he delivered them. That's 2 months' wages for me. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, but so you understand what they represent. People are risking everything to help folks like you get north. Don't waste their sacrifice. When you run, run smart. Be careful. Trust your instincts. And when you make it, when you're finally free and established, help the next person. That's how this works. That's how we defeat this system. One person at a time, building a network that's stronger than their chains. Abel had taken the papers with hands that trembled slightly, understanding the weight of what he was receiving. These weren't just documents. They were hope made tangible. They were the accumulated courage of everyone who had helped forge them and pass them along. I'll make it count, he'd promised. and I'll help others when I can. Through Hartwell, Abel had also made contact with other conductors on the Underground Railroad. There was a black preacher named Reverend Washington who traveled through Georgia regularly, ostensibly ministering to enslaved people on various plantations, but actually passing information and coordinating escapes. There was a white merchant named Thompson who transported goods between Georgia and Tennessee and was willing to hide fugitives in his wagon when circumstances allowed. There was even a woman named Margaret, herself an escaped slave, who had made it north and then returned south multiple times to guide others along the railroad, risking recapture every time. Abel had met Margaret only once, a brief encounter arranged by Hartwell in the woods beyond the plantation during a Sunday afternoon when Abel had been given permission to check trap lines. She was a small woman, maybe 40 years old, with quick eyes and a bearing that suggested both caution and fearlessness. She'd escaped from a plantation in South Carolina 5 years earlier and had been conducting others north ever since. "The first 3 days are hell," she'd told him bluntly. "That's when the dogs are out, when the patrols are looking hardest, when your scent is fresh and they're motivated. You need to put as much distance between you and this place as possible in those 3 days. Don't stop except to hide during daylight. Move at night. Follow the North Star. Keep to the streams when you can to throw off the dogs." "I've heard all this before," Abel had said, though he appreciated the confirmation. "Hearing and doing are different things," Margaret had replied. "When you're out there, when you're exhausted and scared and you hear dogs baying in the distance, that's when knowing what to do becomes crucial. So I'll tell you things others might not. Carry red pepper if you can get it. Sprinkle it on your trail. It throws dogs off. And if you have to hide during the day, don't just find a thick patch of bushes. Find water. Find a swamp. Somewhere you can submerge yourself if necessary. Dogs can't track through water." She'd given him other advice too, practical details born of experience. How to tell if someone was trustworthy or a potential betrayer. How to present himself if stopped by authorities. How to survive on minimal food and water. How to keep moving when every muscle screamed for rest. It was survival knowledge, the kind of education that no school taught, but which could mean the difference between freedom and recapture, between life and death. "Why do you keep coming back?" Abel had asked. "You're free. You could stay north, live your life in safety. Why risk it all by coming back south?" Margaret had smiled, a fierce expression that transformed her face. "Because I remember what it's like. Because I can't enjoy my freedom, knowing others are still in chains. Because every person I guide north is one less person in bondage, one more blow against this evil system. And because someone did it for me, someone risked everything to show me the way, and I owe it to them and to everyone still enslaved to do the same." Her words had stayed with Abel, had shaped his understanding of what his escape could mean. It wasn't just about his own freedom, crucial as that was. It was about demonstrating possibility, about showing others that the barriers could be overcome, about contributing to a larger resistance movement that was slowly but surely undermining the institution of slavery. Sarah had contributed to the planning in her own way, using her access to the main house to gather information that would be crucial for Abel's escape. She'd learned Master Whitfield's schedule, knew when he would be away from the plantation on business, when the house would be least vigilant. She'd discovered that Whitfield kept a cash box in his study, usually containing between $200 and $500, money that could fund Abel's journey north and help him establish himself once he arrived. "I'm not saying you should steal it," Sarah had told him during one of their quiet conversations. "That's for you to decide, but I'm saying it's there, and it's not locked up as well as Whitfield thinks. And a man heading north needs money for food and transport, and bribes if necessary." Abel had struggled with the ethics of theft, knowing that taking Whitfield's money was both justified restitution for years of stolen labor and also a crime that would intensify the pursuit if discovered. In the end, pragmatism won out. He needed resources to survive, and Whitfield owed him far more than a few $100s. The cash, if he could get it, would be taken. Sarah had also been stockpiling supplies for Abel's journey. Small amounts gathered carefully over months, so their absence wouldn't be noticed. Extra cornmeal from the kitchen stores, dried meat from the smokehouse, a warm blanket that had been destined for the rag pile. These items she'd hidden in various locations around the plantation, ready to be collected when the time came. Her help was invaluable, her risk considerable, and Abel was acutely aware of how much he owed her. The night before his planned escape, Sarah had brought him a final gift, a compass, small and simple but functional. It belonged to Master Whitfield's father, she'd explained. Been sitting in a drawer in his study for years. He'll never miss it, and you'll need it when the stars are hidden by clouds or trees. Abel had held the compass in his palm, watching the needle swing and settle, pointing unerringly north. North. Freedom. His father's dream. His own future. "I wish you were coming with me," he'd said. "Not for the first time. I'll follow." Sarah had replied, "Maybe not this year, maybe not next, but I'll find my way north eventually. And when I do, I'll find you. We'll have that life we talked about, that life where we're free to be together without fear. But right now, you need to go alone. You need to move fast and light. And I would slow you down, and we both know it." She'd been right. As painful as it was to admit, Abel's escape would be hard enough alone, with a companion, especially a woman who would be even more noticeable traveling without a white escort. The risks multiplied exponentially, so he'd accepted her decision, had promised to send word when he was safely established, had vowed to help her when her time came to run. All of these plans, all of these preparations, all of these connections and supplies and carefully gathered knowledge had led to this moment, the night when the keys were finished and the time for action had finally arrived. Abel had spent over a year building toward this point, and now, with the master key completed and his duplicate hidden in his apron, the moment of transformation was at hand. On the night Abel planned to disappear, he would first unlock them all, not to steal, not to destroy, but to demonstrate, to show everyone, enslaved and free alike, that the barriers between them and freedom were not as solid as they seemed, that locks could be opened, that cages could be emptied, that the architecture of oppression was built by human hands and could be unmade by the same. As the date approached, Abel had shared his plan with a select few. Sarah, who worked in the main house and knew the routines of the master and his family. Old Marcus, who despite his age commanded respect among the field hands and could organize people when needed. Young Isaiah, quick and brave and desperate for a chance to prove himself. A handful of others, each chosen for their trustworthiness, their courage, their deep desire to see change, even if they weren't ready to run themselves. Abel wasn't asking them to flee with him. He knew that not everyone could leave, that some had children too young to make the journey, that some were too old or too ill to survive the run north. What he was asking was that they be ready for the moment when the locks opened, that they spread the word quietly, that when dawn came and found every door standing open, they would understand it as a message. You are not as powerless as they want you to believe. The night before the key was to be delivered, Abel worked late into the darkness. The forge blazed hot, fed by the best coal, its heat turning the small building into an inferno. Sweat poured down Abel's face and chest. His muscles burned from hours of precise hammer work, but his hands never wavered. He was finishing the decorative scrollwork on Master Whitfield's key, the elaborate design that would make it a worthy gift for the governor. Every curve and flourish was perfect, the craftsmanship undeniable. It would be his masterpiece, the finest work he had ever produced, and it would also be his goodbye. Around midnight, old Marcus appeared at the forge door, moving carefully despite his bad back. He carried a bundle wrapped in cloth, which he set down near the anvil. "This is from Sarah," he said quietly. "Food for the journey. Enough for a week if you're careful." Abel nodded, his throat tight. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked. "Once you go, there's no coming back. They'll hunt you. They'll hunt you hard. A blacksmith is valuable property, and Witfield won't let you go easy." "I know," Abel said, "but I can't stay. Not anymore. Every day I forge chains and locks and cages for our people. Every day I help build the walls of our prison. I can't do it anymore, Marcus. I won't." The old man was quiet for a moment, watching the forge fire dance and shift. "Your daddy would be proud," he finally said. "He always said you were meant for something more than this." "My daddy died in Whitfield's cotton field," Abel replied, his voice hard. "He died because he dared to help someone, because he thought dignity mattered more than safety. I won't let that be for nothing." "What happens after?" Marcus asked. "After you're gone? After we find all the locks open? What then?" Abel set down his hammer and looked at the old man directly. "Then you decide. All of you. Some might run. Some might stay. Some might use what's in the unlocked storerooms. Might take food or tools, or whatever helps you survive. Some might just sit with the knowledge that the barriers weren't as strong as we thought. But you'll know. You'll all know that the locks only work if we believe in them." Marcus smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "You're either the bravest man I've ever known, or the biggest fool." "Maybe both," Abel admitted. After Marcus left, Abel continued working, but his mind was racing ahead to the journey before him. He had studied maps in Master Whitfield's library, memorizing routes north during the rare times he was called to the main house to repair door hinges or window latches. He knew the North Star, knew to follow rivers upstream, knew to avoid roads and towns. He had addresses in his memory, safe houses along the Underground Railroad, though he knew that information could be outdated or compromised. The journey would be dangerous, possibly fatal, but the alternative was to remain here, to continue forging the instruments of his own oppression, and that was a death of a different kind. By 3 in the morning, both keys were complete. Abel held them up to the lamplight, examining every detail. They were identical in function, nearly identical in appearance. though the hidden key lacked the elaborate decorative flourishes of the master's version. Both would turn every lock on Witfield plantation. Both were testaments to Abel's skill, forged with a precision that came from years of practice and the deep knowledge of how mechanisms worked. Abel wrapped the hidden key in oiled cloth and secured it in his leather apron. The master's key he placed in a wooden box lined with velvet, a presentation worthy of its intended recipient. Then he began to prepare for what came next. He banked the forge fire, reducing it to coals that would burn slowly through the remainder of the night. He gathered his father's tools, the ones that had real meaning, the ones that connected him to a life before slavery. These he wrapped carefully and hid in the bundle with his food. He took a final look around the forge, at the anvil where he'd spent so many hours, at the racks of hammers and tongs, at the vise and the grinding wheel and all the implements of his trade. This had been his life for 12 years, and tomorrow it would belong to someone else. Before leaving the forge, Abel took out the hidden key and made his rounds of the plantation. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see by as he moved silently between buildings. First, he unlocked the gate at the plantation entrance, leaving it closed but no longer secured. Then he moved to the main house, testing his key in the back door, the front door, the door to the root cellar. Each lock turned smoothly, silently. He left them all unlocked but closed, maintaining the appearance of security. He unlocked the door to the food stores, where barrels of flour and cornmeal and salted pork were kept. He unlocked the tool shed, the weapons room where Witfield kept his hunting rifles, the smokehouse, the dairy. He unlocked the door to the overseer's office, where the plantation records were kept. He unlocked the punishment shed, where shackles hung from the walls and the whipping post stood like a monument to cruelty. Each lock was a small liberation, a tiny rebellion. Abel moved like a ghost through the sleeping plantation, his key turning in lock after lock, opening doors that had been closed for years. Some of these doors protected valuable goods. Others simply enforced the geography of power, marking spaces where enslaved people were forbidden to enter. Now they stood open, waiting to be discovered. The slave quarters he saved for last. Here lived 53 people, men and women and children, each one owned by Richard Whitfield, each one recorded in his ledgers as property valued between $300 and $1,200 depending on age, health, and skill. Abel knew all of them, had made tools for them, repaired their few possessions, sat with them in the evenings, and shared stories and songs and the small joys that survived even in this place. He moved quietly between the cabins, unlocking the doors that were barred from the outside each night. These locks were simple, just slide bolts really, but they were part of the system of control, a nightly reminder that even sleep happened at the master's pleasure. Abel slid each bolt back, careful not to wake anyone inside. When he was finished, every cabin door could be pushed open from within. Freedom, if they wanted it, was just a touch away. The last lock was on his own cabin, the small space behind the forge where he slept. He unlocked it, stepped inside, and gathered his few possessions, a change of clothes, a knife his father had made, a small book, illegal for enslaved people to own, that he'd learned to read from in secret, a tintype photograph of his parents, taken back in Virginia before everything fell apart. These items went into his bundle along with the food and tools. Abel changed into his traveling clothes, sturdy pants, and a shirt that wouldn't stand out. hat to shade his face. He looked like any other black man who might be traveling the roads with his master's permission, carrying papers that identified him as free. The papers were forgeries, of course, purchased from a contact in town with money Abel had saved up from small repairs he did on the side. The documents wouldn't hold up to serious scrutiny, but they might buy him time, might get him past casual questions. As the sky began to lighten in the east, Abel made his final preparations. He took the master's key in its velvet-lined box and placed it on the workbench in the forge, positioned where it would be easily found when Witfield came looking for it in the morning. Beside the box, he left a note, simple and direct. Key completed as requested. All locks tested and confirmed operational. Abel Jackson. The note was technically true. The key worked perfectly. All the locks had been tested. That they were also now unlocked was information Abel chose not to include. With the first bird songs of dawn beginning to filter through the trees, Abel shouldered his bundle and walked away from the forge. He moved deliberately, not running, not sneaking, just walking with purpose, like someone who had every right to be where he was. He walked past the slave quarters, past the main house, past the cotton gin and the stables. He walked through the plantation gate that he had unlocked hours before. He walked down the dirt road that led away from Witfield land, toward the woods, toward the river, toward the north. Behind him, the plantation slept, unaware that everything had changed. The locks were undone. The doors stood ready to open. The blacksmith who had forged their chains had vanished into the morning mist, taking with him the knowledge of how to undo everything he had built. The sun was just cresting the horizon when Master Witfield discovered the unlocked doors. He had risen early, eager to inspect the completed master key before his trip to see the governor. He'd walked to the forge, found it cold and empty, the key waiting in its box. Pleased, he'd taken the key and decided to test it immediately on the main house locks. That's when he discovered that the front door was already unlocked. Confused, he'd checked the back door, also unlocked. The study, the weapons room, the cellar, all unlocked. His confusion turned to alarm, then to fury as he realized the extent of it. Every door, every gate, every lock on the entire plantation stood open. The food stores were accessible to anyone. The tools, the weapons, everything was unsecured. Witfield roared for his overseers, and soon the plantation was in chaos. Men were sent to check every building, to assess what had been stolen, to understand what had happened, but nothing was missing. The food was untouched. The weapons were still in their racks. Even Whitfield's cash box, sitting in his unlocked study, contained every dollar. It wasn't theft. It was something else, something that frightened Witfield more than any robbery could. When they checked the slave quarters, they found those doors unlocked as well, but all the enslaved people still present, still in their cabins, staring at the open doors, with expressions ranging from confusion to understanding to something like hope. All except one, Abel Jackson, the blacksmith, was gone. His cabin was empty, his tools missing, his forge cold. Witfield immediately organized a search party, offering a substantial reward for Abel's capture. Notices were posted in every town within 100 miles, describing Abel in detail, emphasizing his skills as a blacksmith, his value as property. The amount offered for his return, dead or alive, was $2,000, an astronomical sum that reflected both Abel's worth as a skilled tradesman and Whitfield's fury at the audacity of the escape. But Abel had a head start, and he'd planned carefully. He'd reached the Oconee River by mid-morning, following it north through dense forest where dogs would have trouble tracking his scent through the water. He moved fast but carefully, aware that every hour of daylight was precious. Every mile put between him and the plantation increased his chances of survival. As he traveled, Abel thought about what he'd left behind. He wondered if anyone would take advantage of the open doors, if the message he'd intended had been understood. He wondered if Sarah had found the unlocked food stores, if old Marcus had seen the open gate, if young Isaiah understood what it meant. He hoped they did. He hoped they saw it not just as Abel's escape, but as a demonstration, proof that the systems that bound them were not immutable laws of nature, but human constructions that could be undone by human hands. The journey north took weeks. Abel moved mostly at night, hiding during the day in forests and swamps, following the North Star and the instructions he'd memorized from maps and whispered conversations. He used his forged papers twice, once when confronted by a patrol in Tennessee, and once when he needed to board a ferry crossing the Ohio River. Both times his heart hammered in his chest, certain he would be recognized, captured, returned in chains. Both times the papers held. His calm demeanor convinced the questioners he was just another free black man traveling to visit family. The first 3 days were exactly as difficult as Margaret had warned. Abel moved through the Georgia countryside with desperate speed, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the plantation. He crossed the Oconee River on the first night, wading through chest-deep water that was cold despite the summer heat, his bundle held above his head to keep it dry. The current was strong, and twice he nearly lost his footing, nearly let the river sweep him away and solve all his problems with a quick drowning. On the second night, he heard dogs in the distance, their baying carrying through the darkness like the voices of demons. Abel's heart had seized with terror, and he'd immediately waded into a swampy area, submerging himself up to his neck in stagnant water, breathing through a hollow reed he'd cut for exactly this purpose. He'd stayed there for 3 hours, mosquitoes swarming around his face, leeches attaching to his skin, the sounds of the dogs growing closer, and then, mercifully, fading away. When he finally emerged, shaking with cold and fear and relief, he'd continued moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death or recapture, which was the same thing, really. He'd made it to the Pemberton store on the 4th day, arriving just before dawn, exhausted and hungry and desperate. He'd approached carefully, watching the building for signs of a trap, looking for patrols or slave catchers who might have learned about this station and set up an ambush. But the store seemed quiet, peaceful, just a simple building with living quarters above and goods displayed in the windows below. Abel had knocked on the back door, 3 slow knocks followed by 2 quick ones. The signal Hartwell had taught him. A woman had answered, middle-aged, with kind eyes and a concerned expression. She'd taken one look at Abel, recognized immediately what he was, and ushered him inside without a word. Only when the door was locked behind them did she speak. "Benjamin sent you," she'd said. Not a question, but a statement. "Yes, ma'am. He said you might help me. We help those who come seeking help," Pemberton had replied. "My husband is in town, But he'll be back soon. You're safe here for now. Are you hurt? Have you eaten? She'd led him to a hidden room beneath the store. A space dug out of the earth and lined with wood, accessible through a trapdoor concealed under a rug. It was cramped and dark but dry and relatively comfortable, with blankets and a water jug and a chamber pot. Abel had descended into that space with gratitude, finally able to rest, to stop running for a few hours, to let his guard down slightly. Mrs. Pemberton had brought him food, simple fare but abundant, bread and cheese and apples, cold chicken and buttermilk. Abel had eaten slowly, forcing himself not to devour it all at once, knowing that his stomach had shrunk during days of minimal rations. While he ate, Mrs. Pemberton's husband had returned, a quiet man named Joseph who looked him over with an appraising eye and asked practical questions about Abel's journey so far, his plans for the next leg, his skills and abilities. "You're a blacksmith," Joseph Pemberton had said when Abel described his trade. "That's good. That's a skill that will serve you well up north. There's always need for skilled metal workers, and you'll be able to establish yourself, earn a living, build a life. Not everyone who comes through here has marketable skills. Some were field hands, some house servants, some just general laborers. They struggle more to find their footing in the Free States." The Pembertons had let Abel rest for a full day and night in their hidden room, allowing him to recover his strength, to tend to his blistered feet and the various cuts and scratches he'd accumulated during his flight. On the second night, Joseph had taken Abel in his wagon, hidden under a false bottom that could accommodate one person lying flat. They'd traveled for 8 hours, Joseph sitting calmly on the driver's seat as if he were just making a normal delivery run. Abel cramped and uncomfortable in the hiding space below, listening to the rumble of wheels and the clip-clop of horse hooves. They'd stopped at another safe house, this one run by a black family named Washington, no relation to the preacher but connected to the same network of conductors and sympathizers. The Washingtons lived on a small farm just south of the Tennessee border, growing vegetables and raising chickens, maintaining the appearance of simple farmers while secretly sheltering fugitives and passing them along the Underground Railway. Abel had spent 2 nights with the Washingtons, and they'd shared stories of others who had come through, of successful escapes and tragic recaptures, of the constant risk and the absolute necessity of their work. Mr. Washington had been born enslaved, had purchased his freedom 20 years earlier, after his master's death had resulted in a provision in the will, allowing certain slaves to buy themselves. He'd paid $800 for his freedom, money he'd saved over decades from selling vegetables and doing odd jobs, and having experienced the weight of slavery, he was determined to help others escape it. "Every person we help north is a victory," Washington had told Abel. "Small maybe, individual, but victories nonetheless. This system, it wants us to feel powerless, wants us to accept our condition as inevitable, but it's not. It's human-made, which means it's human-breakable. You're proof of that. You studied your chains until you understood them. Then you used that knowledge to break free. That's how we win, one person at a time, each one showing others that escape is possible." From the Washingtons, Abel had been passed to a white conductor named Harrison, a merchant who genuinely opposed slavery on moral grounds and had been helping fugitives for over a decade. Harrison had transported Abel hidden among barrels and crates in his wagon, traveling through Tennessee toward the Kentucky border. It had been a tense journey, with multiple stops at checkpoints where Harrison had to explain his cargo and his destination, all while Abel lay perfectly still and silent just feet away, hoping desperately that no one would decide to search the wagon thoroughly. In Kentucky, Abel had spent 3 days hiding in the loft of a barn belonging to a German immigrant family named Mueller. They spoke limited English, communicated more through gestures than words, but their sympathy was clear. They fed him well, gave him clean clothes to replace his worn and dirty garments, and Mr. Mueller, himself a blacksmith, had spent an evening talking to Abel about metalworking techniques, a conversation that transcended language barriers through their shared understanding of the craft. "In my country," Mueller had said in broken English, "no slaves, all men free. This American slavery, it is wrong, against God, against nature. I help because it is right thing to do." The journey through Kentucky had been particularly dangerous. The state was a border state, torn between southern sympathies and northern connections, and slave catchers were active and well organized. Abel had moved more carefully here, traveling only on the darkest nights, avoiding any roads or settlements where possible, living off the land when he couldn't reach a safe house. One night, while hiding in a wooded area near a small town, Abel had witnessed a recapture. He'd heard the dogs first, then the shouts of men, then the agonized screams of someone being dragged from a hiding place. From his concealed position, Abel had watched as slave catchers hauled a young man, probably not even 20 years old, out of a hollow beneath a fallen tree. They'd beaten him savagely. Chains had been locked around his wrists and ankles, and he'd been thrown into a wagon like a sack of grain. Abel had remained frozen, knowing he couldn't help without revealing himself, without ending his own escape attempt. The guilt of his inaction had burned in his chest, but survival had demanded he stay hidden, stay silent. Let another man be taken so he might remain free. It was a choice that would haunt him, one more scar added to all the others slavery had inflicted on his soul. The crossing into Indiana had been the most terrifying moment of the entire journey. The Ohio River marked the boundary between slave and free states, between legal bondage and legal freedom, and it was the most heavily patrolled border in the region. Slave catchers knew that fugitives had to cross this river, and they watched the ferries and bridges and likely crossing points with constant vigilance. Abel had used his forged papers to board a ferry, presenting himself as a free black man traveling north to seek work. The ferryman had barely glanced at the documents, too busy with the mechanics of operating his vessel. But halfway across the river, a patrol boat had approached, officers aboard calling out to check passengers. Abel's heart had nearly stopped. Certain this was the end. Certain his luck had finally run out. "Papers," a hard-faced officer had demanded, boarding the ferry and moving from passenger to passenger, examining documents with suspicious eyes. Abel had handed over his forged freedom papers with hands he fought to keep steady. The officer had studied them for what felt like an eternity, looking from the papers to Abel's face and back again. "Says, here you're from Virginia." "Yes, sir," Abel had replied, keeping his voice neutral, his eyes down. "Born free in Richmond. I'm traveling to Cincinnati to find work as a blacksmith. Lot of runaway slaves try to pass themselves off as freemen," the officer had said. "How do I know you're not one of them?" Abel had forced himself to meet the man's eyes, projecting a confidence he didn't feel. "I'm a skilled tradesman, sir. I have my tools with me." He gestured to his bundle. "I can show you my work if you like. Show you I know my trade. A runaway field hand wouldn't have these skills." The officer had considered this, weighing probabilities, trying to read Abel's face for signs of deception. Finally, with a grunt, he'd handed back the papers. "Move along, but if these papers turn out to be false, if someone reports a missing slave matching your description, we'll hunt you down and collect the reward." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The ferry had completed its crossing, and Abel had stepped off onto Indiana soil with legs that trembled, with relief so intense it was almost painful. He was across. He was in a free state, legally. At least on paper, he was free now, though practically the danger wasn't over. The fugitive slave law meant he could still be captured and returned, even in the North, if someone identified him as escaped property. But still, free soil beneath his feet, the Ohio River between him and Master Whitfield, the physical journey nearly complete, even if the psychological journey would last the rest of his life. The Underground Railroad helped him in small ways. A meal here, a safe barn to sleep in there, always at great risk to those who offered assistance. Abel met black conductors and white abolitionists, Quakers who believed slavery was sin, and former slaves who risked everything to help others escape. Each encounter reminded him that he was not alone in his fight, that the dream of freedom was shared by thousands, that the system that seemed so absolute and permanent was actually riddled with cracks and weak points, held together more by fear than by actual strength. He crossed into Pennsylvania in late October, after nearly 3 months on the run. The leaves were turning gold and red, and the air had a crisp quality he'd almost forgotten from his childhood in Virginia. He was thin, exhausted, his feet blistered and his clothes worn, but he was free, actually, legally free, standing on free soil, no longer property under the law. Abel made his way to Philadelphia, where the black community helped him establish himself. He found work as a blacksmith again, but this time for wages, this time with the freedom to walk away if he chose. The work was the same, hammer and anvil and fire, but everything was different because he was doing it as a free man. The chains he forged now were for horses and gates, not for people. The locks he made secured homes and shops, not cages. The journey to Philadelphia had taken another week beyond reaching Indiana. Abel had traveled with more confidence now, though still cautiously, still aware that the fugitive slave law meant danger could come even in the North. He'd been directed to Philadelphia by conductors in Indiana, told that the city had a substantial free black community, active abolitionist organizations, and opportunities for skilled workers. He'd arrived in November, as winter was beginning to assert itself. Philadelphia was larger than any city Abel had ever seen, with broad streets and tall buildings, busy markets, and crowded neighborhoods. The sheer number of black people moving freely, working, owning businesses, living lives without the constant threat of the lash or the auction block, had been overwhelming at first. Abel had stood on a street corner, watching black men in fine clothes conducting business, black women shopping without white supervision, black children playing without fear, and he'd wept, unable to contain the emotion of witnessing what he'd barely dared to imagine during his years in bondage. The black community in Philadelphia had its own mutual aid societies, organizations designed to help new arrivals establish themselves. Abel had been directed to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where Reverend Allen had listened to his story, verified his skills, and helped him find both housing and work. The Reverend was a powerful figure in the community, a man who had himself been born enslaved and purchased his freedom, and who now dedicated his life to helping others and building institutions that would support and protect Black people. In freedom, you have skills the community needs, Reverend Allen had told Abel. We have a blacksmith, Joseph Turner, who's getting on in years. He's been looking for someone to help him, potentially to take over the business when he retires. I'll introduce you. Joseph Turner's shop was in a busy neighborhood, a solid building with living quarters above and the forge below. Turner was in his 60s, a man who had been free his entire life. Born to freeman parents in Pennsylvania, his skill was evident in the work displayed around the shop. Everything from decorative ironwork to practical tools, all crafted with obvious expertise. He'd examined Abel's hands, asked him technical questions about metalworking, and then had him forge a simple hook to demonstrate his abilities. Abel had worked carefully, aware he was being tested but confident in his skills. He'd heated the iron to the right temperature, shaped it with efficient hammer blows, finished it with attention to detail. When he presented the completed hook to Turner, the older man had smiled. You learned from someone good, Turner had said. The technique is sound, the work is clean. You can start Monday if you're interested. The pay is $1.50 a day to begin. More once I see what you can really do. You'll live upstairs until you can afford your own place. Abel had accepted immediately, barely able to believe his fortune. Real wages, a place to live, the opportunity to practice his trade as a free man. It had felt almost too good to be true. And for the first few weeks, he'd kept expecting something to go wrong, for slave catchers to break down the door, for Master Witfield to somehow reach across the miles and drag him back to Georgia. But gradually, as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, Abel had begun to believe in his freedom. He'd worked diligently at Turner's forge, proving his worth, earning the older man's respect and trust. The work was satisfying in ways it had never been on the plantation, because now every piece he created belonged to him and Turner, not to someone who claimed ownership of Abel's very existence. When customers praised his craftsmanship, the compliments felt real, meaningful, not just acknowledgement of a master's property performing its function. Abel had rented a small room in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, a formidable woman who took in lodgers and ruled her establishment with strict but fair guidelines. The other residents were mostly working people, free Black men and women employed in various trades and occupations, and from them, Abel learned about life in Philadelphia, about the opportunities and the challenges, about the racism that persisted even in the North, about the constant threat posed by slave catchers who operated with impunity under the fugitive slave law. Never get too comfortable, a fellow lodger named Charles had warned him. I've seen men living here for years, thinking they were safe, and then slave catchers show up with papers claiming them as property. The law doesn't care if you've been free for a decade. If someone can produce documents, real or forged, claiming ownership, they can take you back south. Stay vigilant. Know your rights. Keep your freedom papers with you, always. Abel had taken this advice seriously, always carrying his forged documents, always aware of his surroundings, always planning escape routes should the need arise. But he'd also determined not to live in constant fear, not to let the threat of recapture prevent him from building a real life. He'd survived the plantation, survived the dangerous journey north, and he was determined to thrive, not just survive, in freedom. Within 6 months of arriving in Philadelphia, Abel had become active in the abolitionist movement. He'd attended meetings of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, heard speakers like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, met other formerly enslaved people who were now working to end slavery entirely. His story, the tale of the blacksmith who forged a master key and used it to free himself while unlocking every door on the plantation, had spread through these circles, becoming something of a legend, an inspiration to others who fought the same battle. Abel had been asked to speak at various gatherings, to share his story, to describe life under slavery and the journey to freedom. He'd been reluctant at first, uncomfortable with public speaking, uncertain whether his experiences warranted such attention, but Reverend Allen had encouraged him, explaining that personal testimonies were powerful tools in the fight against slavery, that white audiences needed to hear directly from formerly enslaved people about the realities of bondage. Your story demonstrates intelligence, planning, courage, the Reverend had said. It undermines the lies slaveholders tell about enslaved people being content, being incapable of self-determination, being better off in bondage than in freedom. When you speak, you're not just telling your story. You're representing thousands who can't tell theirs. That's a responsibility, but it's also an opportunity. So Abel had spoken, haltingly at first, uncertain and self-conscious, but growing more confident with practice. He described life on Witfield plantation, the daily indignities and occasional horrors of slavery, the determination to be free, the careful planning of his escape. He'd talked about the master key, about the symbolism of unlocking every door, about demonstrating that the barriers between slavery and freedom were not as solid as they seemed. His speeches had been effective, moving audiences to tears and to action. Donations had flowed to abolitionist organizations. New members had joined the movement, and Abel had found purpose beyond his work at the forge. He was contributing to something larger than himself, helping to build the pressure that would eventually, he hoped, bring down the entire institution of slavery. Abel had also become involved with the Underground Railroad from the other end, helping newly arrived fugitives establish themselves in Philadelphia. He'd met people at the stations where they arrived, exhausted and terrified and hopeful, and he'd helped them find housing, find work, navigate the complexities of life in a free state. He'd used his connections in the community, his growing reputation, his own experiences, to smooth the path for others as it had been smoothed for him. One winter evening, a young woman had arrived from Maryland, brought by conductors who said she'd been traveling for 3 weeks, sleeping in barns and cellars, eating whatever she could scavenge, her feet wrapped in rags because her shoes had fallen apart. Abel had been called to help, and when he'd seen her face, something had shifted in his chest. Her name was Grace. She was 23 years old, and she had escaped from a Baltimore household where she'd been a domestic servant. Grace was educated, unusual for an enslaved person. Her previous owner had been a peculiar sort, believing that Christianity required teaching slaves to read the Bible even if such education was illegal under Maryland law. Grace had learned not just to read but to write, to cipher, to absorb knowledge like a plant absorbing sunlight. Her literacy had made her valuable, but it had also made her dangerous in the eyes of her enslavers, and when her owner died and his heirs decided to sell off his property, Grace had known she would be sent south, probably to the cotton fields, where her education would be wasted, and she would be worked to death within years. So she'd run, using her literacy to forge her own travel passes, using her intelligence to evade capture, using her determination to keep moving north even when exhaustion and despair threatened to overwhelm her. By the time she reached Philadelphia, she was on the verge of collapse, physically and emotionally spent, but still fierce in her determination to be free. Abel had helped her find housing, helped her find work as a seamstress with a Quaker family who valued her skills and her intellect. He'd visited her regularly, ostensibly just to check on her welfare, but really because he found her company compelling, her mind sharp and challenging, her spirit unbroken by her ordeal. She'd been interested in his story too, had asked detailed questions about his escape, about the master key, about the philosophy behind unlocking all the doors rather than just running. "You weren't just saving yourself," Grace had said during one of these conversations. "You were making a statement. You were teaching. That takes courage beyond just running." Their friendship had deepened into something more over the following months. They'd attended abolitionist meetings together, had long conversations about politics and philosophy and what freedom truly meant, had discovered a compatibility that went beyond shared experiences of slavery. Abel had been careful, had moved slowly, had given Grace time to establish herself, to heal from her trauma, to be certain of her own feelings. A year after Grace's arrival in Philadelphia, they'd married in a simple ceremony at the AME church, surrounded by friends from the community, by fellow abolitionists, by people who understood what it meant for two formerly enslaved people to choose each other freely, to build a life together unencumbered by the threat of forced separation. Reverend Allen had officiated, his blessing carrying weight because he understood the significance of a marriage between free people who had fought for that freedom. News from Georgia came slowly, carried by other refugees and by the abolitionist newspapers that tracked the system of slavery and celebrated every successful escape. Abel learned that Witfield had never recovered his investment, that the reward had never been claimed, that Abel Jackson had simply vanished into the vastness of the North like thousands of others. He learned that the incident of the unlocked doors had become something of a legend on the plantation, a story told and retold, growing in the telling. Some said Abel had magic, that he'd used conjure to open all the locks at once. Others said he'd forged skeleton keys for everyone in the quarters, that they all had the power to free themselves if they chose. The truth was simpler and more complicated than any of the legends, but Abel didn't mind the embellishment. Legends served a purpose. They kept hope alive. What Abel didn't learn until years later was the full impact of what he'd done that night. The open doors had indeed been a message, and it had been received. Over the following months, 5 more people escaped from Witfield plantation, more than had ever run in a single year. They'd seen the doors standing open, had understood what Abel was saying, and had found their own courage. Some were caught and returned. Some made it north and found Abel in Philadelphia, and they shared stories and built new lives together. The unlocked doors became a symbol, proof that freedom was possible, that the architecture of oppression could be dismantled. Master Witfield, for his part, became obsessed with security after Abel's escape. He installed new locks, better locks, more complicated locks. He hired additional overseers, organized more frequent patrols, created new punishments for anyone suspected of planning escape. But all his efforts couldn't change the fundamental truth that Abel had demonstrated. Locks only work if everyone agrees they're unbreakable. Once that agreement shatters, once people see that barriers can be overcome, no amount of iron or fear can fully restore the old order. The master key that Abel had forged with such care never made it to the governor's mansion. Witfield couldn't bring himself to display it, couldn't tell the story of how his most skilled slave had created a perfect key and then used that knowledge to humiliate him. The key stayed in Whitfield's desk drawer, a constant reminder of his failure to control someone who knew too much, who understood the systems of power too well. Abel eventually married in Philadelphia a free woman named Grace, who had escaped from Maryland. They had 3 children, and Abel taught them his trade, passing down his father's tools and his father's knowledge. But he also taught them the story of the unlocked doors, made sure they understood that their freedom hadn't come easily, that it had been fought for and won through courage and planning and the willingness to risk everything. In the evenings, Abel would sometimes take out his own copy of the master key, the twin to the one Whitfield kept in his drawer. He'd hold it up to the lamplight, examining the scroll work, the precise tolerances, the mechanical elegance of its design. It was beautiful work, perhaps the finest thing he'd ever made, and it represented something important. Not just his escape, though it had enabled that. Not just the open doors, though that had been its purpose, but something larger. The knowledge that no barrier is permanent, that every lock has a key, that power is never as absolute as it pretends to be. Abel lived a long life, long enough to see the Civil War come and go, long enough to see slavery abolished by law throughout the country. He was an old man by then, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but he still worked the forge occasionally, still taught young people his trade, still told stories about Georgia and the night everything changed. He never went back to Witfield Plantation, never saw the place again, but he heard that it fell into disrepair after the war, that the main house stood empty and rotting, that the cotton fields were reclaimed by forest. The story of Abel Jackson became part of the larger narrative of resistance and escape, one tale among thousands of black people who refused to accept their enslavement, who fought for freedom in ways large and small. Some of the details were lost or changed in the retelling. Some became exaggerated into legend, but the core of the story remained true. A blacksmith forged a key, opened every lock, and disappeared into freedom. What mattered most to Abel wasn't his individual escape, though that had been necessary for his survival and his sanity. What mattered was the message he'd sent, the demonstration he'd made, that the systems that oppressed them were human-made and therefore could be human unmade. That knowledge was power, that understanding how things worked meant understanding how to break them. That freedom wasn't a gift to be granted by others, but a condition to be claimed by the courageous. The forge where Abel had worked on Witfield Plantation eventually crumbled, its iron tools rusting away, its anvil sinking into the Georgia earth. But the knowledge that had been born there, the understanding that every lock can be opened if you know how, that spread and grew and could never be destroyed. It passed from person to person, generation to generation, a legacy more enduring than iron. In his final years, when Abel's children asked him about that night, about the decision to forge the duplicate key and unlock every door, he would tell them it wasn't really a choice at all. He'd been forging his own freedom for 12 years, link by link, understanding by understanding, until the moment came when all that preparation crystallized into action. The key was just metal shaped by fire and hammer. The real key had been the knowledge, the patience, the refusal to accept that locks were permanent and cages were destiny. Your grandfather taught me to work iron, Abel would tell his grandchildren, but Georgia taught me why I needed to. Every chain I forged for others was a lesson in how chains worked, how they could be broken. Every lock was a puzzle to be solved. Every cage was a challenge to overcome. They thought they were using me to build their power. But really, I was learning how to tear it all down. On a winter evening in 1874, Abel Jackson died in his sleep at his home in Philadelphia. He was 63 years old, a free man, surrounded by family who had never known slavery except through his stories. His children buried him with his father's tools, the ones he'd carried north all those years ago, and they buried him with that key, the duplicate master key that had opened every lock on Witfield plantation, the symbol of his courage and his craft. The key went into the ground with him, but the knowledge lived on. It lived in the stories his children told their children. It lived in the tradition of skilled craftspeople, understanding the power of their knowledge. It lived in the understanding that systems of oppression are never as solid as they seem, that they have joints and seams and weaknesses that can be exploited by those who take the time to study them carefully. Back in Georgia, long after Whitfield was dead and his plantation dissolved, people still told stories about the blacksmith who vanished. They told stories about the morning when every door stood open, when the illusion of absolute control shattered like glass. They told stories about Abel Jackson, who forged keys for others but ultimately used his knowledge to unlock his own freedom. The truth was that Abel had done something more radical than simply escaping. He demonstrated the possibility of escape, proved that the barriers were not as insurmountable as they seemed. He'd taught everyone who witnessed those open doors that locks only worked if people believed in them, that the power structure of the plantation was maintained not just by force but by the acceptance of that force as inevitable. When the doors stood open that morning, when the gates swung free, when the food stores and tool sheds and weapons room all stood accessible, it wasn't just about the physical unlocking. It was about unlocking possibility itself, about showing that change was achievable, that the world could be remade by those with the knowledge and courage to remake it. Abel's legacy spread beyond that one night, beyond that one plantation. His story joined the larger story of resistance, becoming part of the oral tradition that sustained enslaved people through their darkest hours. Somewhere, someone planning their own escape would hear about the blacksmith who forged his master's key and used it to free himself. Somewhere, someone working in a forge would understand that their knowledge gave them power, that understanding how things were built meant understanding how they could be unmade. Somewhere, someone would see a locked door and know that locks could be opened, that barriers could be overcome, that freedom was not a distant dream but an achievable reality. The fire in Abel's forge burned out eventually, the coals cooling to ash. But the fire he'd lit in the hearts of others continued to burn. It burned through the years of slavery that remained, through the war that ended it, through the difficult years of Reconstruction, through all the struggles that followed. It burned in the knowledge that oppression is never permanent, that human ingenuity and courage can overcome even the most entrenched systems of control. When historians later studied the Underground Railroad and the various escapes from slavery, Abel Jackson's story was sometimes included, sometimes overlooked. The facts were murky, the details uncertain, the documentation sparse. Enslaved people didn't leave extensive written records, and masters preferred not to publicize successful escapes. But the story survived in oral tradition, passed down through generations, preserving the essential truth, even if some details were lost or changed. What remained constant was the image of those open doors, standing in the dawn light like an invitation, like a promise, like a prophecy. Every lock on Witfield plantation stood open. The blacksmith who forged them had vanished, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The story of Abel Jackson reminds us that resistance takes many forms, that knowledge is power, that understanding the systems that bind us is the first step toward breaking free. It reminds us that one person, working in the darkness, forging their freedom one link at a time, can change the world. It reminds us that locks only work if we believe they're unbreakable, and that belief can be shattered by someone brave enough to turn the key. In the end, that's what Abel did. He turned the key. He opened the doors. He walked into freedom, leaving behind a message for everyone who remained. This is possible. You are not as powerless as they tell you. The barriers are not as strong as they seem. And if you have the knowledge, if you have the courage, if you have the will, you too can forge your own key and walk through your own open door into freedom. The forge may be cold now, the anvil silent, the hammer still, but the sound of that metal being shaped, the ring of iron on iron, the hiss of hot steel meeting water, those sounds echo down through the years. They echo in the stories we tell, in the freedoms we enjoy, in the understanding that no form of oppression, no matter how entrenched, is permanent or unbreakable. Abel Jackson forged more than keys and chains and locks. He forged a legacy of resistance, a tradition of using knowledge as power, a demonstration that freedom can be achieved by those brave enough to seize it. And on that summer night in 1839, when he walked away from Whitfield plantation with the master key in his pocket and every door standing open behind him, he proved something essential, that the architecture of oppression is built by human hands and can be dismantled by those same hands. If only we have the knowledge, the courage, and the will to use what we know to break ourselves free. The story ends with Abel free, with doors standing open, with a message delivered and received. But in another sense, the story never ends. It continues in every act of resistance, every assertion of human dignity against systematic dehumanization, every moment when someone uses their knowledge and skills to break free from the systems designed to contain them. Abel's story is our story, a reminder that freedom is not granted but claimed, that knowledge is power, and that every lock, no matter how strong it seems, has a key waiting to be forged by someone brave enough to shape it and wise enough to know when to turn it. That night in Georgia, the forge burned hot one last time. The hammer rang against the anvil. The key took shape in skilled hands, and when morning came, Abel Jackson was gone, vanished into history and legend, but leaving behind proof that freedom was possible, that locks could be opened, that the world could change. All it took was knowledge, courage, and the willingness to forge your own key to freedom. The master key still exists somewhere, perhaps in a museum, perhaps in an attic, perhaps buried with Abel in Philadelphia. But the real key, the one that matters, is the knowledge itself, the understanding that systems of oppression are human-made and therefore vulnerable, the recognition that locks only work if we believe in them, the courage to study our chains until we understand how to break them. That key can never be lost, never be stolen, never be destroyed. It exists in the stories we tell, the lessons we learn, the determination to be free. And as long as those stories are told, as long as that determination survives, Abel's forge still burns, his hammer still rings, and somewhere, someone is learning to forge their own key to freedom.